Letter B. The development of property and the role of agreements. Smith's account of the departure from the primitive state of hunting and gathering has much in common with Grotius' discussion of the extension of the simple use right to the right of property. The crucial development is that people can lay claim to things without having to maintain physical possession. Grotius had said that after the first extension of ownership, not even immovables, such for instance as fields, could remain unapportioned. Smith says that the step between a society of hunters and one of shepherds is the greatest in the progression of society. When this is once established, it is of no great difficulty to extend this from one subject to another, from herds and flocks to the land itself. In this way, property would in time be extended to almost every subject. Both authors associate this departure with agreements. People agreed that ownership of a thing once seized could continue without uninterrupted possession for as long as the intention to recover possession was indicated and regarded as reasonable. Flocks and other immovables were the first things to become subject to this extended form of ownership, followed by the occupation of whole territories by the people, and finally the allotment of land by division. Grotius had emphasized that the introduction of conventional property was a gradual process, and that it was patterned on the natural right of use. Smith elaborates on this account by arguing that the gradual nature of the development of property is accompanied by the development of the human imagination, an idea that Smith undoubtedly took from Hume. Property always expresses the idea of human control over the world, but it is only in the first stage of society that it is a direct physical relation between a person and a thing. It is in shepherding societies that property is first extended beyond possession. It is then that people agree that a cow or a sheep shall belong to a certain person, not only when actually in his possession, but wherever it may have strayed. Initially, this extension of property was confined to what could be understood as being within the power of the shepherds, and thus only to those animals that had the habit of returning. They considered therefore all animals to remain in the property of him whom they appertained at first, as long as they retained the habit of returning into his power at certain times. Eventually, this limit was broken, and it was enough that the animal was distinguished in some way to indicate that the possessor regarded the thing as his. There are also important similarities between the two accounts of the privatization of the land. Common ownership of land is first abandoned when the whole nations divided off countries and possessed them separately. Grotius says that this happened as a result of the increase in the number of men and flocks, which necessitated the allotment of land to individual families. As population grew, settlement became dispersed, and this hindered the gathering of the products of the soil into a common store. This process of occupying land in some cases took place by free occupation by individuals, but in most cases it was the result of an explicit division. Smith similarly says that private property in land never begins until a division be made from common agreement. Movable property may be occupied in the first beginning of society, but lands cannot be occupied without an actual division. Smith says that historical records confirm this account. But he also provides an explanation in terms of his evolutionary theory. He says that the jump from individual acts of occupying movables or immovables, like huts and houses, to individual occupation of the land was too great to be bridged by the imagination of men in the age of shepherds. Occupation of land began with whole nations of shepherds taking possession of large territories. As long as people lived a nomadic life, the thought of ownership in land did not extend beyond short periods of time. They would not easily conceive a subject of such extent as land is, should belong to an object so little as a single man. The habitation of hunters and shepherds is frequently changing, and property in the land on which they build their huts was thought to end when they were left, just as the seats in a theater or a hut on a shore belongs no longer to any person they are possessed of them. Even the invention of agriculture did not immediately necessitate private property. Private property in land was introduced as a result of people fixing their habitation and building cities. After people settled their habitation and acquired private property in dwellings, they would naturally wish to cultivate the fields nearest to where they lived, and under such conditions it was easier to make a division of the land rather than be put to the unnecessary trouble of dividing the product every year. Thus, the principal persons of such a community or state would divide the common land into separate portions for each individual or family. C. Natural rights. In the Prolegomena in De Jure Praede, commentary on the law of prize and booty, Grotius had derived two precepts of the law of nature from the will of God. It shall be permissible to defend one's own life, and it shall be permissible to acquire for oneself and to retain those things that are useful to life. The right to acquire what we need initially amounted to a right to use the common. After the introduction of private ownership, it became a right of occupation. In mare liberum, both these rights are natural rights because they are derived from the law of nature, and they are possessed by all men equally. Grotius says that they are expressed under the term natural community. Natural rights pertaining to property are thus the rights we possess in the state of nature, in the state of natural community, and they are rights to the common. They can both be understood as natural rights in the sense that in exercising them we are exercising rights we are born with. In one case it is a natural right to use things in the common, and in another case it is the right to occupy things as private property. However, private property is not a natural institution, and Grotius quoted Cicero, who said, "There is nothing private by nature. For things to become private property of an individual, some deed of the man should intervene." The account of property in De Jure Belli, however, entailed a significant qualification of the idea of a natural right to acquire private property. Natural property rights continued to play an important role in Grotius' theory in the form of the original use right and the right of necessity. But the right of occupation, the right to occupy, becomes a conventional right. Grotius' contention that things are not private by nature and that people acquire property through some deed was accepted by all theorists by all the theorists we are discussing in this essay, but the distinction between natural and conventional rights divided them. Pufendorf thought that all property rights are conventional, and even the first and simplest uses of the earth's resources required a pact of some kind. Carmichael, Hutcheson, and the Scottish writers prior to Smith, with the obvious exception of Hume, attempted to recast all property rights as natural rights. The position that Carmichael and Hutcheson adopted is essentially the same as that outlined by Grotius in Mare Liberum, although given the publication history of the main work, De Jure Praede, in which Mare Liberum first appeared as a chapter, it is not likely that there is any direct influence. The position was that there is a natural right to use the common and a natural right to acquire private property through occupation. Hutcheson says that both of these rights are part of a more general right which he calls natural liberty, which is essentially the natural right of innocent use of our natural faculties. Property itself, however, is an acquired right because it requires, as Grotius said, the intervention of a human deed. However, Carmichael and Hutcheson misleadingly took Pufendorf's terminology of natural rights and adventitious rights. Pufendorf had distinguished between congenital and adventitious obligations. The former are those that attach to all living beings endowed with reason, as opposed to the latter, which are laid upon men by reason of some antecedent deed, with their express or presumed consent. The basis for Pufendorf's distinction was the different sources of authority, and the essential feature of an adventitious obligation was consent. In contrast, congenital obligations are imposed by God. Pufendorf's purpose was to establish the existence of natural law, and to do this, he argued that not all obligations arise from consent when men enter political society. In the natural, or pre-political state, men are under the authority of the natural law, which consists in the obligations imposed by God. Now, in terms of rights, this means that in a state of nature, there are natural or congenital rights that correlate to the duties imposed on us by God, and that in adventitious states there are in addition what we may call, although Pufendorf does not, adventitious rights, rights that have their origin in agreements. The adoption of Pufendorf's terminology of adventitious rights by Carmichael and Hutcheson was clearly inappropriate for their inappropriate for their purposes, but it is clear enough that they are simply using it to denote the much broader category of acquired rights. Smith, however, who inherited the chair of moral philosophy in Glasgow, as well as Hutcheson's teaching duties, adopted the same terminology but added his own twist, which had been doubly confusing for interpreters. Smith describes adventitious rights as rights that belong to a man as a member of a family, or as a member of a state. Natural rights, by contrast, are those that belong to a man as a man. This classification no doubt served Smith's purposes in dividing the presentation of his subject matter into private law, domestic law, and public law, much as Hutcheson had done. But it is unhelpful in conveying the essential features of the theory of rights he developed in his lectures. Given Smith's translation of Pufendorf's classifications, it is obvious that he must classify property rights as natural rights, as he does in L.J. We do not own property by virtue of our membership of a family or state or any other social institution, and we do not have to enter any social or political institution before we can become property holders. On the other hand, for Smith, as for other theorists, property is acquired. However, if we look beyond Smith's unhelpful terminology, we see that his theory of property indicates the same distinctions that are found in De Jure Belli. In the first stage of society, in which people live by the law of nature, there is a natural right to occupy and use things as long as possession is maintained, but for the right of private property to extend beyond possession, an agreement is needed. So property rights for Smith, as for Grotius, are natural rights in the first stage of society, but conventional thereafter. For Grotius, however, natural rights are natural because they are derived from the natural law, which in De Jure Praede, at least, Grotius derived from the will of God. In Smith's theory, natural law is replaced by human sentiment as the foundation of our rights, and property rights depend upon a certain kind of social recognition. We only have a property right to a thing because an impartial observer concurs with our expectation of having the exclusive use of it. But this does not make all Smith's rights conventional rights. Smith thinks that the bare possession of a thing is enough to generate the reasonable expectation of use on which the right of property is based. The physical power over an object by one individual produces a moral power as a necessary and natural consequence of the sympathetic reaction of an impartial spectator to any attempt by another to take the object from the possessor. Moreover, the sympathetic reaction of the impartial spectator is not mere passive acquiescence. The attempt by the second comer to take what is already possessed engages the sympathy of bystanders in a way that prompts them to intervene. It arouses sympathetic resentment and the consequent desire to defend the victim and punish the offender. This is an idea that comes very close to Grotius and Locke's idea of a natural right to punish. It is also the crucial point in understanding how the moral effect produced by possession is a perfect right in the sense explained by Grotius. Conclusion. Duncan Forbes remarked that what Grotius and Pufendorf wanted to stress was that property in its very nature implies agreement between men. What makes the theories of Hutcheson, Kames, and Dalrymple so different from the theories of both Grotius and Pufendorf is the fact that they entirely eliminate consent from the story. In this respect, Smith was closer to Grotius and Pufendorf than he was to his contemporaries, but Smith's similarities with Grotius go much deeper. For both Grotius and Smith, there was an original state of the world in which the only economic activities were hunting and gathering, and in which property began and ended with possession. Agreements are needed at the point when people begin to engage in activities that necessitate an extension of their control over the world. The extension of property, first to movables and then to land, was a gradual process, not just in the sense that it involved a series of steps, which was a commonplace in natural law theories, but because it entailed an expansion in men's conceptual powers. Because they thought that a limited idea of ownership existed in the first societies prior to agreement, they were able to provide a genuinely evolutionary history that is more than just a series of agreements, as it is, for example, in Pufendorf's theory. However, the theological and scriptural background to Grotius' theory, which is entirely missing from Smith's, reflects a crucial difference in their conceptions of the relationship between mankind and the natural world. The transition from the natural state was brought about in Grotius' account by desire for a more refined way of life, and only subsequently by the increase in population. Since Grotius understood the world as a gift from God, it was unthinkable that, as long as men remained in the natural and simple state in which God had made them, there could be insufficiency of resources to satisfy their needs. The refinement in wants, as is presented in De Jure Belli, is inextricably bound up with the fall and corruption of mankind, and the introduction of private property is closely connected with God's renewal of the world after the fall. It would not have been necessary if men had remained the way God made them, but it became necessary as a result of diverse and superfluous wants. For Smith, the driving force of change is confined to population growth. The introduction of shepherding and later agriculture were the products of men's inventiveness in overcoming scarcity, not to a refinement in their wants. Moreover, Grotius' theory was, in essence, a two-stage theory. Shepherding, farming, and commerce were introduced together. This was a transition from a state of nature, or natural liberty, to the state of private property. Smith added more detail, although not necessarily greater historical accuracy, in building his theory around the four-stage model that had been the focus of so much scholarly attention. Smith's originality in being the first to present a clear articulation of that theory, which occupied scholars, seems highly questionable in view of the content of his early Glasgow lectures. It is, in any case, a question of secondary importance, but if what I have argued in this article is correct, Smith was the first thinker successfully to have used this four-stage theory in explicating the foundations and historical development of property, and his greatest debt was to Grotius.